Cast aside everything they have conditioned you to believe about justice, fairness, and conventional morality, and listen to the reality of this world as it truly is, not as they wish it to be. In this vast existence, humanity is governed by invisible laws, laws that do not recognize the weak, nor protect those who wear the armor of a victim. If you desire absolute sovereignty over your reality, you must first comprehend the greatest ideological warfare fought between two minds that reshaped human consciousness: Nietzsche and Machiavelli. The Machiavellian school looked outward, dissecting the brutal architecture of control, mass manipulation, and pragmatic political realism, where the end justifies the means, and where strategic silence and calculated absence are the ultimate weapons. To subdue your adversaries, Friedrich Nietzsche, however, plunged deep into the abyss of the self, shattering conventional moral idols, dismantling the guilt-driven slave morality, and forging human consciousness through the will to power and the master morality. These are the elite who transform their darkest trials and most silent traumas into raw fuel to en force absolute, dominion over their destiny. This video is not for the casual consumer. This is an advanced psychological and cognitive protocol. In the next 20 minutes, we will break down the hidden nexus between these two masters. We will teach you how to fuse the ruthless external strategy of Machiavelli with the unyielding internal power of Nietzsche, allowing you to construct an impenetrable mental fortress and command your life. With frozen iron discipline, hold your breath. Let the ultimate clash begin. When the idealistic speeches of moralists fade and the actual gears of the world begin to grind, that is precisely where Niccolò Machiavelli stands. If Nietzsche teaches you how to build power within yourself, Machiavelli is the man who reveals how to execute that power on reality without letting emotion blind your vision. The first phase of the sovereignty protocol demands that you internalize this cold truth. The world is not ruled by good intentions, but by strategic mechanisms. Machiavellianism, in its purest essence, is not a call for chaotic evil. It is the psychological anatomy of dominion. Machiavelli realized that the masses are governed by two primary currents, fear or love. And when he laid both options upon the altar of cold awareness, his verdict was absolute. It is much safer to be feared than loved. If you cannot be both, why? Because love is a volatile emotion, granted by people based on their personal interests, and stripped away the moment those interests shift. But fear is an invisible chain forged inside their own minds, rooted in the dread of consequences and strategic detachment. And that chain never fails you when order must be enforced. Here, we unlock the most notorious and heavily guarded code. The end justifies the means. The average mind misunderstands this phrase as a cheap license for betrayal. But the sovereign intellect decodes it completely differently. The end here is not petty personal gain. It is the establishment of stability and the preservation of the sovereign fortress. The Machiavellian master understands that human nature is fickle, deceptive, and prone to breaking. Therefore, utilizing strategic absence, sharp silence, or absolute ruthlessness is not unjustified cruelty. It is the necessary psychological surgery required to keep the reins of control firmly in your hands. The manipulators and narcissists in your daily life use a diluted, cheap version of Machiavellianism. They inject you with guilt to control you. But when you adopt cold realism, you expose their cards instantly. You stop explaining yourself, and you cease apologizing for your strength. You become the architect of the game, because you have learned to sever your emotions from your strategic decisions. Remember this: a master does not ask for permission to rule his reality. He constructs the conditions that make his leadership inevitable. But if this is the architecture of controlling the outside world, how do we protect the inside from collapsing? How do we ensure this frozen realism does not turn into a destructive internal void? This is exactly where Friedrich Nietzsche steps in to rewrite the rules of the game entirely. If Machiavelli taught you how to move the chess pieces across your external reality, Friedrich Nietzsche is the one who breathes an unyielding, unbreakable spirit into those pieces. Machiavelli shields you from the deception of others, but Nietzsche shields you from your own weakness. The second phase of the sovereignty protocol requires you to descend into the deepest dungeon of your consciousness to face the truth that everyone else flees from. The fundamental driver of the universe is not survival, but the will to power. Nietzsche shattered the traditional intellectual idols that deify weakness. He ruthlessly divided human consciousness into two irreconcilable domains: slave morality and master morality. Slave morality feeds on victimhood, resentment, and injecting others with guilt as a defensive tool to weaken the strong. It is a mindset that rationalizes helplessness and calls it a virtue. But master morality? It is born from pride, severe self-discipline, and the absolute affirmation of suffering. The Nietzschean sovereign expects no fairness from the world, blames no circumstances, and wallows in no trauma. Instead, he views his deepest pain and most silent isolation as raw material, to be melted down and recast into the overman, the supreme master of self. This is where Nietzsche introduces his most terrifying code, the Eternal Recurrence, and the philosophy of Amor Fati, the radical love of fate. The master does not wish for a different past, nor does he wish his traumas had never occurred. He looks back at his scars, at the moments where manipulators tried to break his pride, and he declares with absolute sovereignty, "I willed it thus, and out of it I forged my current psychological armor." This ruthless acceptance completely strips pain of its authority, turning internal ash into dominant, reigning power. When you fuse this perspective with your cold realism, the elite transformation occurs. You instantly stop justifying or apologizing for your intensity or your ambition. You realize that iron discipline and strategic silence are not ways to hide, but the very fortresses where you realign your cards away from the noise of the herd. Remember, the will to power begins within. He who holds absolute command over his own emotions and self automatically inherits the authority to direct his reality. But what happens when the ruthless, external engineering of Machiavelli meets this internal thunder of Nietzsche? How do we forge these two ideological extremes into a single, devastating weapon to be deployed in your daily execution? Now, we reach the climax. Chapter 3, The Grand Convergence. When the Machiavellian, mind that dissects external games, meets the Nietzschean gravity that conquers internal pain, the pure elite consciousness is born. And the mindset of absolute sovereignty. Most human beings live in a state of chronic fracture, either possessing a naive kindness that makes them easy prey for manipulators, or a twisted realism that ends in isolation and psychological ruin. But the elite operate on a completely different protocol. They know that cold realism without internal resilience is just a fragile mask, and that internal strength without strategic external mechanisms is wasted energy. The synthesis is the ultimate weapon. Applying this protocol to your daily execution requires the simultaneous activation of two hidden codes. The first code, Nietzschean severity, toward the self. You completely stop blaming your environment, your past, or your setbacks. When a narcissistic or manipulative individual attempts to inject you with guilt or hesitation, your gaze does not waver. You look at your pain and your silent isolation as premium fuel to accelerate your iron discipline. You do not apologize for your dominance, nor do you explain your ambition to anyone. Your self-sovereignty is your baseline. The second code, Machiavellian realism toward the environment. You deal with human beings exactly as they are, not as you wish they were. You deploy calculated absence and razor-sharp silence to command authority and draw uncrossable boundaries. You learn exactly when to seal the gates of your mind against external noise and how to manage your networks with a cold, pragmatic utility that protects your grand objectives, your career, and your personal evolution. When you merge both codes, The world ceases to be a minefield of psychological manipulation and transforms into an expansive chessboard, where you dictate the flow of the game. Your highest goals and your structural stability become your only compass. There is no room for hesitation here, and no space for volatile emotions that drain your intellectual energy. Always remember, sovereignty is not a garment you put on in times of strength. It is a psychological fortress you build with cold, iron discipline in the middle of the storm. We have dismantled the internal code, engineered the external terrain, and fused both powers into one unshakable sovereign mindset. But how do we translate this elite awareness into a sustainable, daily operational loop to start harvesting massive execution? We arrive at the final code, the loop of immediate deployment. Now, having unmasked the dark codes and the structural dominion shared between Machiavelli and Nietzsche, the time for theory ends and the hour of execution begins. The awareness you have obtained in the last 20 minutes is not mere casual information to be consumed before returning to your old life. This is a severe cognitive weapon. If you do not deploy it with frozen precision and iron discipline in your daily life, you will remain a mere gear in a machine operated by someone else. The first actionable step of the sovereignty protocol begins tomorrow. Look at your immediate circle. Identify the manipulators and parasites who drain your psychological bandwidth, and completely sever their access using strategic absence and absolute silence. Stop explaining your moves and stop apologizing for your ambition. When you face your loneliest nights or heaviest pressures, remember the code of Amor Fati: love your fate. Melt the pain and turn it into the raw fuel needed to build your mental fortress. The world does not grant sovereignty to those who wish for it. It surrenders it to those who enforce it through their own systems. You now possess the complete code. Machiavelli to defend the outside, and Nietzsche to command the inside. The choice is now yours. Remain a spectator on the chessboard, or become the master who directs the entire game. Save this protocol deep within your consciousness to return to it whenever the storms try to crack your discipline. Share it with a single mature mind operating on your level of power. And confirm your presence in the comments by writing "Protocol Sovereignty Activated." Follow the channel, for what comes next will entirely rewrite the rules. The code is set. Let your sovereignty begin now.